Let's see, Chapter 14, Iron Ships and Wooden Men. A little bit of Shakespeare to start off. Gonzalo. Now would I give 1,000 furlongs of sea for an acre of barren ground, long heath, brown furze, anything. The wills above be done, but I fain would die a dry death. Shakespeare. Rigid with cold and gnawing hunger in his belly, Bert gripped the spokes of the 6-foot mahogany wheel. The cover of the starboard skylight directly over his head had been lifted neatly by a gust and sent whirling off into the night. The boy's sou'wester was gone, too. He did not remember when he had lost it, and the icy gale seemed to strike directly down on his bare head and thrust its chill fingers inside the collar and up the sleeves of his oilskin until they reached every inch of his body. When he moved, his feet could feel the squoosh of the water in his rubber boots. Opposite him, on the port side of the wheel, stood Dago Gus. For though the bark would not steer, 2 men were kept constantly at the wheel to hold it hard over and ease it now and then when an unusually vicious sea wrenched at the rudder. Gus was poor company. His usually smiling face was writhed with fear, and across his trembling lower lip saliva dripped constantly. The sight of the man's abject terror cheered Bert, whose own nerves were none too steady. He smiled to himself. I never before saw a man so scared that he drooled at the mouth, he thought. Dago Gus had laughed at him for stumbling over a ring bolt in the deck. Now the boy fought against an impulse to return the compliment. But after all, they were facing death, and when the bark wallowed sickeningly for the last time as the storm-swept waters closed over it, well, perhaps he'd lose his nerve too. Bert craned his neck upward to watch the dark silhouette of the jiggermast lashing swiftly back and forth across the heavens. Low-flying scud dimmed the stars for brief moments, but never obscured them. They shone with cold intensity in greater numbers than Bert had ever seen before. Back and forth across the body of the Great Bear swayed the mast, and down to port and then to starboard until it seemed that it would surely strike the seas that rose to meet it. And all the while Bert was trying not to hear the terrible crashing blows of the piles on the main deck. But when he closed his ears to the sound, he felt the blows with his body, for the whole vessel quivered and shook from their impact. He knew what was happening as well as though he were seeing it. With every roll to windward, the piles, now completely free of their lashings, hurled against the deckhouses and hatches with the force of battering rams, while the sluicing water on deck added to their momentum. When the bark recovered drunkenly and rolled to leeward, they shot down against the bulwarks, sometimes floating so high that they struck the shrouds. When this happened, the mast jerked visibly. If only the piles could be got overboard. But they were prisoners on the bark as much as the 300 men of the China gang and the crew. The door on the starboard side of the wheelhouse opened halfway, and Captain Hagestrom thrust his head and shoulders outside. "How is she heading?" he asked. "Northwest to half-west, sir," Bert answered, wondering what difference it made since the bark wasn't steering. "The sheep. It is going to sink, Captain?" Dago Gus waited tensely for the answer to his question. The skipper looked at the man's face and laughed grimly. "Sure, we're going to sink. If the hatches get stove in, and if the bulwarks and shroud goes, we'll be dismasted. It's a toss-up which happens first. What's the matter, Gus? Afraid to die?" Gus babbled incoherently, and the captain looked at Bert, his face softening into a smile. The boy grinned in answer. "You'll have a good story to tell your father when you get back to Frisco, if you get back," said the captain. So Captain Hagestrom knew who he was. "Yes, sir," Bert answered, "I will." Then the master of the Queen of Asia closed the door. Bert saw him clinging to a ventilator, his face to the storm. A lull in the wind brought to Bert's ears the sound of splintering wood and the terrified squeals of pigs. The piles have smashed their pens, he thought. A few minutes later, the ceaseless squealing drew nearer and seemed to come not from the main deck, but from the water overside. When the door opened to admit big Oscar Sandstrom, one arm in a sling, There was no mistaking the location of the pigs. They were swimming alongside and wailing desperately whenever they could get their snouts above water. Bert looked at Big Oscar's face. The Swede was on the verge of tears. "Those poor pigs," he choked. "They swim and they swim. The piles kill them or they drown. They got no chance." At first, remembering that 2 days before Oscar had crushed a man's ribs with a blow of his fist, Bert had an impulse to laugh at the boatswain's grief over a few pigs who were dying as every man aboard expected to die before daylight. "Pork or fish bait? What difference does it make to the pigs?" Bert asked as he relinquished his place at the wheel to the Swede. But Oscar was inconsolable. Bert had offered this bit of logic as much for his own benefit as for the boatswain's, for he felt the need of checking his own emotion. What a gallant struggle the creatures were making. At least the butcher's knife was swift, but in the cold water, terrified by the coming death, which they could sense but could not understand, they might fight for hours before exhaustion brought the release of death. Bert wondered if it would not be easier for a man to die. Weighted down by boots and clothing, he would sink quicker, and he would understand the reason for his death. Would that make it easier? Perhaps Seaman number 28 would find out for himself. Feeling his way from the poop down to the lazarette, Bert suddenly thrust his hand under his oilskins and dragged forth a sodden mass that had been a sardine sandwich. Food for the gods, he ate happily. Never had anything tasted so good. Now, if only he had a cup of coffee. As if in answer to his prayer, a figure lurched down the passageway holding a flashlight in one hand and in the other a steaming coffee pot. It was Sparks. "Come on," he said to Bert, and turned into the officers' mess. "Nothing doing in my line since the rolling broke half the battery connections," he went on. "So I scouted around and found a fire in the Chinese galley. Behold the result." Bert paused, a cup halfway to his lips. "The captain," he suggested. "Sure," said Sparks. "On my way now," and he lurched up the inside stairs to the poop. In the lazarette, Bert climbed stiffly into dry clothing and lay down on his bunk for a 5-minute rest, clinging to the side of the bunk with both hands to hold himself in. It had been 8 bells, midnight, when he left the wheel. It was 6 bells of the middle watch when he opened his eyes with a start and found himself still clinging to the edge of his bunk. Not until he looked at his watch did he realize that he had slept for nearly 3 hours. Conscience-stricken, he raced down the corridor and opened the iron door at its end. Half a barrel of water poured over the 18-inch sill against his legs and went running down the passage. He closed the door quickly. His glimpse into the night told him that nothing had changed. The wind and sea still raged while myriads of stars glittered out of a clear sky. The deckload of piles still thundered and crashed back and forth with the insane rolling of the vessel. The boy retraced his steps as far as the officers' mess and climbed the inside stairs to the poop, stairs that were ordinarily sacred to the captain. He hoped for another trick at the wheel. It was better to be busy than idle, and now there was nothing to do on this storm-battered bark but hold the wheel against the kick of the seas. As Bert emerged to the poop from the lee side of the chart house, an eddy of the roaring wind brought him the voice of the chief mate. "Poker gust is out," he was saying. "Got bumped in the head trying to get a line around the piles. He'd have washed over like the pigs if Charlie hadn't caught him. Pete Condon got bumped too. Don't know how. He's out of his head. What about the 3 who—" The captain's last words were lost in the noise of a sea that crashed against the vessel's quarter and washed halfway across the poop. "They didn't refuse to go aloft," said the mate. "Just couldn't. Never saw men so scared, still in their bunks, though God knows how they stay there. Remember the days when we had wooden ships and iron men, Captain? Now we have iron ships and wooden men." The sound of the wind in the rigging rose to a shrill screech as the bark rolled far to windward. "Wooden men," the captain was saying, "but no wooden ship ever built stand a battering like this." Bert waited till the bark was rolling toward an even keel, then darted for the wheelhouse door. Old Smith and Carl Anderson, boatswain of the second mate's watch, were at the wheel. Anybody want relief? Bert asked. I do, said the boatswain. Old Smith just came on. All right, Bert answered. Mind letting me have the starboard side, partner? I'm more used to it. Without a word, the old man relinquished his place to the boy and himself took Anderson's place on the port side. The cover to the port skylight was still on, while the starboard side, the wind whistled unchecked around the boy's head and body as when he stood his first trick earlier in the night. He smiled to himself as he pulled the knitted wool cap down over his ears. At the end of an hour, during which no word was spoken between the two, a man came to relieve old Smith. Only one man came, so Bert stayed on. The captain seemed not to notice that one man was doing 2 tricks in succession, and the boy was quite satisfied to stay. When old Smith left, the stars were growing dim, and toward the end of Bert's second hour, the eastern sky brightened with the light of day. Relief came at last. Releasing his double grip on the wheel, the boy stepped back and spent 5 minutes kicking, stamping, and beating his arms against his body in an effort to restore his circulation. Then he stepped out of the wheelhouse to the deck and stood spellbound, gazing over the surging mountains of water at the sun rising warm and bright out of the storm-swept sea. In the face of death, he had lain down and slept, but now he threw his arms out in an unconscious gesture of homage toward the sun that brought a new day, a new chance for life and hope. Had the wind slackened a little? Were the piles battering bulwarks and hatches and deckhouses with slightly less force? What good steel plates had stood all through the night? They might stand a little longer, until the sea moderated, or, working in daylight, the men could get the piles under control. With sudden pity, Bert remembered the men in the tween-deck quarters. What a perfect hell it must be down there under closed hatches, breathing the unspeakably foul air and listening to the terrible crashing of the piles on the deck above their heads. Would they be maddened to the point of overwhelming the weary crew, or would they be cowed into abject submission to authority? Time would tell, perhaps. Meanwhile, the bark wallowed in the trough of the seas and staggered on the crests as the newly risen sun sent a warm glow through the bitter cold air to remind Bert Lindsay, and every other man who felt it, that life was still worth fighting for.